Dr. Tom Groome is Professor of Theology and Religious Education at Boston College. A native of County Kildare, Ireland, and now based in the United States, Tom is widely recognised as one of the leading religious educators and catechists in the world. Dr. Groome was in Australia in May 2016 for a series of workshops across a number of dioceses. This interview was recorded by Catholic Education Services Cairns as part of a series of interviews on parent engagement and understanding of the role of the Catholic school.
Well, it was a Dublin City final, and my school, an old oblate school, Belcamp, was in the final, and it was my first time actually to play on the senior team, and they got a free. We got a free about 20 seconds left of the game, and the game was tied, and they chose me to take the free, and we were probably 15, 20 yards out at most, and I stood up to take the free to win the game, to be the Dublin City champions that year, and I put the ball wide. I had put that ball over the bar 1,000 times, but this time it went wide. We went back into the dressing room afterwards, and our coach, who I'll leave nameless for now because he's gone home to God, lined us up in the dressing room. And he said, "Now, gentlemen," he said, "I'm sure a lot of you have bitterness and anger in your heart at Tom, and I can well understand why you would. And now," he says, "you can do either of two things with that anger. You can keep it inside of you, or you can get rid of it." And he drew a line across the dressing room floor, and he put me one side, and he put the team the other side. And he said, "Now, anybody who would like to forgive Tom, cross over that line." Well, I, of course, stood there terrified and hoping somebody would cross the line. Well, eventually one of my buddies did, and then another one did, and then another one did, and eventually everybody crossed the line. And we've met years later, and that's the story people tell. Because in many ways, that old coach, who was a religion teacher as well, and actually he was a rather miserable religion teacher, but that day he taught us more about reconciliation, forgiveness, mercy, compassion. We've remembered it all our lives. And I suppose to me that's the epitome of the kind of values that we find reflected and should find reflected in Catholic schools. And I suppose the point I want to make is that what goes on in a Catholic school, the Catholicity of the school doesn't depend on the religious education. The religious education, of course, is a terribly important aspect of the curriculum, but nonetheless, it permeates the whole environment and all the ways of going about, even the sports and the athletics and so on. Good Catholic values should be reflected there, and typically they are. Well, if you take, for example, science, I mean, the deep Catholic value that undergirds science is our Catholic principle of sacramentality, the notion that God is present in the ordinary and the everyday. When Catholics hear the word sacrament, we typically think of the 7 sacraments, and of course that's perfectly appropriate, but nonetheless the principle of sacramentality is actually deeper. The principle of sacramentality is that God is always present through creation, through other people, through sunsets and sunrises, the smile of a grandparent, the hug of a child. God is present to us throughout our lives. So when you bring, and then of course that's why we have the audacity to show up in our churches and to believe that our God comes looking for us through bread and wine and water and oil and lovemaking and marriage. But the 7 sacraments are simply the tips of the iceberg of what is in fact the sacramentality of life. Now, if you bring that into the science curriculum, for example, I mean, good Catholic science, there's no such thing as Catholic science. In one sense, science is science. But how we would approach science, we would get young people to look, whether they're looking through a microscope or looking through a telescope, we should invite them to see the beauty of it, the grandeur of it, the design of it, the consistency of it, the miracle of it. Because the transcendent is in the immanent, the ultimate is in the ordinary. And so in a sense, a good science teacher in a Catholic school, without ever using God talk, can give young people a sacramental outlook on life. Can give them a whole way of looking at things where they see the more in the midst of the ordinary, convinces them that there's always more than meets the eye. And of course, that's the presence of God in all things. As Ignatius of Loyola said, we can come to see God in all things. As I walked around this afternoon here in this beautiful Cairns, and with no R, that's Cairns, I just said, I remembered I remembered Paul, St. Paul, writing to the Romans and basically saying to them, look, if you don't believe in God, then take a look at nature around you. And I said to myself, oh my goodness, the people of Cairns must surely believe in God, given the beauty of the place. Now, a Catholic sacramental outlook that can be nurtured through our teaching of the sciences would get people to look at things that way and to see, as Ignatius of Loyola would say, the presence of God in all things. Well, let me tell you why we decided to send Teddy to a Catholic school. There's a little school, there's a grade school beside where we live, in fact 200 yards from where we live, Spalding. And it is one of the highest ranked grade schools in America. In fact, it's in the top 100, which means that it's in the top 0.001% of grade schools in America. So my wife and I, we just presumed out of being responsible parents that we should surely send Teddy to Spalding School. Well, he was beginning to be ready for kindergarten, as we would call it, and I called up Spalding School and I said my wife and I would like to come to a parents' evening of orientation to the school. We're interested in sending our son Ted there, and when is your next parents' evening? And the person who answered the phone said, that's on the website, sir. You can look it up on the website, www blah 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 blah. I said, yeah, thank you very much, but could you tell me something about, I'd like to know more about the school. Could we come perhaps and have a conversation with the principal? I'd like to hear a little of the philosophy of the school. Oh, sir, the principal never meets with prospective parents. No, sir. No, you get it all on the website, sir. It's all on the website. Our philosophy is very, very public on the website. I said, well, but then could you tell me when is the next gathering that I could come to? Well, sir, I told you before, it's on the website, being rather angry with me. I got off the phone and I said, I don't care how good a school it is, we're not sending Ted there. And we were right. It was that kind of school. Excellent academically, but the environment wasn't a place I would want him to be. By contrast, I called up a little school, a little further, quite a bit further away. It was going to be a bit of an inconvenience in the morning getting him there and so on. A little school run by the Sisters of St. Joseph. I called, I didn't use my name because my name is somewhat recognizable in Catholic schools in Boston, and I asked when was the next parent evening. Oh, we'd love to have you come. In fact, next Wednesday evening we're having a wine and cheese, we'd love to have you. And I said, well, would there be a possibility of visiting perhaps a little while with the principal? Oh, Mrs. Nyden would love to see you. When can you come in? Please, oh, we'd love to see you. I went in and met with Mrs. Nyden, and of course we decided to send Ted to that little school. And in some ways the point I'm making is how we answer the phone should reflect Catholic values of hospitality, of welcome, of inclusion, of respect, of community, because that's what we found in that little school. And it was a great place for him. He prospered there. And we had a very similar experience at the end of 6th grade when we were looking for a new school, a high school or a junior high school, as we would say. And again, we decided to send him to Catholic Memorial, which is an old Irish Christian Brothers school, another side of the city from us, but nonetheless very much worth the effort. So the whole ethos of a Catholic school should reflect good Catholic values. A lot depends on what we mean by practicing Catholics. Now, when sociologists try to measure that, the most obvious variable that they look at, because it's readily, it can be ready data, is how many are going to church. And I would hope that all Catholic Christians would go to church every Sunday. I do. I have a 15-year-old son, Teddy, who doesn't want to come to church with us, and we bring him anyway. And I told him he has to keep coming at least until he's 18, and after that, if he comes home for the weekend. So my fondest hope and desire is that Catholic Christians continue to participate actively in a Catholic Christian community. However, we have to be very careful not to assume that if they're not going to church, that then they're not practicing their faith. I think, I would hope that the vast majority of graduates of Catholic education who have a Catholic identity, I mean, at least as in the United States now, we have very varied backgrounds in our students coming from many different traditions. But the ones who come from and go back into Catholic traditions, I always have the fondest hope, and I think I'm right, and confident that I'm not just fooling myself, that they are practicing their faith. They're practicing their faith in God, their faith in Jesus Christ. They're trying to live out of the values that we attempted to inculcate in them through our Catholic education. I wish they'd all go to church as well. But we can't just assume that because they're not going to church that they're not practicing their faith. I think, and there's all kinds of research on this now, at least in my country, that many people who say that they're no longer practicing Catholics, when you get down into it with them, over 70% of them pray regularly, pray every day. And hopefully, as I said, live by the values of social justice and compassion and mercy and inclusion and hospitality and respect and so on, that we tried to teach them when they were with us in their Catholic schools. I wish they'd all go to Mass still, but I think some of the responsibility has to be shouldered by the church. At least in my context, we have to shop around to find a good parish. It's easy to find a parish where the quality of the liturgy is poor, the sermons are not well crafted and don't say much to people's everyday lives. So in other words, if a parish doesn't have good liturgy, this generation will stop coming. Now, my generation, we wouldn't dream of missing. And my parents' generation, even more so. You'd never miss Mass. But this generation, these postmodern young people, these millennials, if they're not getting well served in their parishes, they won't keep coming. In the United States, we have a statistic that something like of the people who leave and no longer identify themselves as Catholic, and we have a very large number in the States that do that, sadly. One of the reasons they give for not coming anymore is that their spiritual needs were not being met. Now, I think that's tragic. I mean, that's enough to make a big person cry, because there's no richer aspect of Catholic faith than its spirituality. In many ways, that's what it is. It's a great, rich spiritual wisdom for how we live our lives. And for us not to be representing that in our parishes and giving people ready access through the life of the parish is a failure on the church's part. So the churches can't be blaming the schools. I think now, the church gave rise to this great school system throughout the world, not just here in Keynes, but through all over the world. And for the last 2,000 years, the church has given rise to this extraordinary system of education. So in a sense, now it's the education's time to give rise to the church. It's payback time. But meanwhile, I think our parishes often leave a lot to be desired. Now, Pope Francis is bringing a new spirit of hope to us and so on, that we can turn things around. But a lot of the excitement that Catholic Christians have after the Second Vatican Council dissipated or disappointed people. And I think as we move back to that understanding of the church and its role to be a sacrament of God's reign in the world, I think as we re-embrace that, I think we begin to do better by way of Mass attendance. I think Catholic schools have to actively engage the family, because in a sense, as it says it to the parents at baptism, you will be the first educators of your children in the ways of faith. And when we give them the lighted candle from the Easter candle, we tell them this light is given to you to be kept burning brightly. And in a sense, parents have to take on their responsibility by way of nurturing their children in faith. In many ways, the schools are secondary. The parents are the primary socialization. I mean, how can you raise a Polish person only in a Polish family? How can you raise a Lithuanian person, an Irish person, only in an Irish or a Lithuanian family? How can you raise a Catholic person? In many ways, only in a practicing Catholic family. It's a culture, it's an identity that we want people to take on. It's not just a list of beliefs and a creed. Yes, of course, it's great beliefs and truths and wisdoms for life, but the identity of the child is formed primarily in the family. So the family has to be an active partner with the school in the efforts to inculcate what we would understand as a good Catholic education. I think when we have students in our classes from other traditions, we have to be very respectful of their identity. We should never get into some kind of proselytizing of the non-Catholic students in our schools. That would be to take dreadful advantage and totally inappropriate. Now, I distinguish, and it's a very important distinction, between proselytizing and evangelizing. Evangelizing is telling people what we believe. Proselytizing is telling people what they should believe. Now, we're not entitled to tell young people in our classes that you should believe all this. What we can do is we can expose them to the richness, to the spiritual wisdom of Catholic Christian faith, and then invite them to learn from it for their lives. I taught undergraduates at Boston College for 33 years. These are young university students. And I taught a course called Catholicism 1 first semester, Catholicism 2 second semester. I had students from all kinds of backgrounds. And I remember I would often say to them, I haven't taught in a while being chair of my department, but the undergrads, I teach graduate students, but I'd say to the young men and women in my classes, Mohammed, I want you to be a better Muslim, because of you taking this class. And Abraham, I want you to be a better Jew. And Murphy, you might become a better Catholic. And I would expose them to Catholic Christian faith, but in a way that they could learn from it. And I was greatly flattered here a couple of years ago. A young man, well, he's not so young anymore, I suppose mid-40s, came back for his 25th anniversary, his silver jubilee of his graduation, came back to Boston College, and he sought me out. And he said, Professor, he said, you helped to make a better Muslim out of me by the way you taught the Catholic faith. And he found resonance, he found empathy, he found insight that enriched his own faith life. So I think there is a way. Now, a lot depends on the pedagogy. I think there is a way of being very faithful to our representation of our Catholic Christian faith, and yet not in a way that imposes, but that invites people to learn from it, to take its wisdom to heart, and to take it on and to enrich their own faith life. Catholic Christian faith is really the deep structures, the deep values of Catholicism are universal. Now, for us, they arise out of God's revelation through the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, through the height and fullness of God's revelation in Jesus Christ. So these values for us, we have a faith, a reason and rationale for holding them. But in fact, they're universal values, and any person of goodwill can benefit from them. There was a great debate at the beginning of the church, because the risen Christ on the hillside in Galilee, Matthew chapter 28, commissioned the disciples who were assembled there to go evangelize and teach. And a debate emerged in the early church. Should the church be involved in education? Isn't it enough for the church simply to teach the gospel? Should it also be involved in teaching reading, writing, arithmetic? In other words, giving a good education. It was a great debate. And the church decided that it should do both. And that's how Catholic education began, arising out of the faith, and yet engaging critical reason, because faith and reason, from a Catholic perspective, faith needs reason and reason needs faith. This is the Catholic intellectual tradition. And so the schools began to emerge in the early Christian communities, led on into the monastic schools, the Benedictine schools, and of course I would mention the great Celtic schools, on into the cathedral schools of the 11th, 12th century, on into the great universities, all of the great universities of the Western world, Paris, Bologna, Salamanca, Oxford, Cambridge, they were all founded by papal charter and staffed by the emerging religious orders of the time, the Augustinians and the Benedictines first, and then Augustinians, Dominicans, later then Jesuits and Presentations and Mercy and all the rest of it. But in many ways, the intellectual life of the Western world arose out of the Catholic faith and out of the Catholic schools. And those schools spread throughout the world. It's now by far the largest and the oldest educational system in the world. When you put the schools of Cairns with the schools of Australia, with the schools of America, the Catholic schools of Ireland, England, Africa, Asia, it's the largest and the most important educational system in the world. It has done this service for 2,000 years now. I think it will go on doing it.